Chapter 5. Descent. I still think about John. He was there at the very beginning. A part of me still has hope to see him again.
Major!
A voice said over the headset.
Major, what happened in there?
Major Jacobs knew this was his fault. But no longer could he do this. He couldn't just go in there and kill. Again. Besides, it wouldn't have mattered anyway. All the intel pointed to Abudia. But there was no way to stop it by stopping Abudia. The noise and wind of the chopper blades shrieked through the open doors in the warm desert night. He had no idea how much time they had, but he knew it was very little. Time seemed to drip slowly, not flow. What have I done? The Major felt strangely regretful and out of control. He felt the eyes on him, waiting for him to make the calls. He heard the voices, but was paralyzed, catatonic. In this moment, he could not take action. It was the right thing to do, right? He wondered. Alder was gone. He was like a son to him, a brother, a confidant, his tether to a sense of normality. Maybe, if he hadn't decided to get soft in Abudia, he could have at least saved him. Alder trusted him with his life. Now, look where that got him. All the other men had learned nothing. They were entirely too loyal.
Major!
The pilot was flying blind. He didn't know where he was to go. He had to save the men. He had to salvage something. He looked down at his watch, remembered Abudia's story of his father's watch. There's no place for us to go. No place without watches. The simple and harmless machines that many displayed as a symbol of status.
Major!
Came the pilot's voice. They let us go, Captain, Jacobs managed. We need to get out of the air as soon as possible. Out of the air and off the grid.
Sir?
Get us on the ground, as far away from any populated area as possible. Do you understand? There was hesitation. Yes, sir. Matt walked through the airport. It was filled with empty faces. He felt as the world was in slow motion. He searched. His glance bounced from face to face. None seemed to notice him. Alas, it was that same loneliness that ached in his heart for the last 6 months. It had not lessened or changed. It had paused for the past week. But now, it had returned. All whom he had felt for, cared for, and all the effort he put forth to connect left him once again alone. Now, here he was. Getting to meet and travel with Becky was such a stroke of luck. He strangely missed not being alone. He certainly screwed that up. The thought of what happened with Becky was still embarrassing. I can't believe I called her Steph, he thought. There could have been something between them if he were to stay. But Matt had come to the realization that he just couldn't do a relationship right now. He had already started out pretty poorly. The only comfort now was the thought of home. To be with his mother, father, and his sister. He could hardly wait to get back to those he loved. But it also meant he had to go back and finally face the life that he had left behind. He didn't know if he had the strength to do this. Would he look for her? The feeling swirled around in his head and heart. He only wished, at that second, he could turn off the thoughts, the feelings. Inevitably, he knew there was no way to escape them. For a fleeting moment, he considered not heading back to Maryland. Where else could I go? He thought. There was not much else out there for him. The brief moment of crisis ended. He treaded towards the gate, where he would ride to Cleveland for his layover.
Breaking news. Seemingly well-planned attacks have taken place in 13 different countries against the WPF in the last 3 weeks. It's unclear whether these attacks were carried out by a single entity, but it's widely speculated that this is the work of one network. President Santre is to address the nation tonight on what many believe is to be a declaration of war against this rebel network and the crimes against the, quote, upholders of the freedom of the global community. The presidential address will be shown live tonight at 9 p.m. on...
Matt's attention drifted from the television screen. He thought about the men and women out there in the WPF. He empathized with them, far away from their homes and families, following through on their duty to uphold the law of man. In return, they were attacked. The same type of thing had happened for centuries. He laughed to himself, cynically. Humans all seem to know that war is terrible, and yet it keeps repeating itself throughout each chapter of history. Matt wished he understood. He wondered of the friends he had in the WPF. He hoped they were not being attacked. He remembered what he had gone through, raised a hand to his chest where he had been shot. He was lucky to survive. Strangely enough, Matt and his peers never pondered the philosophical questions surrounding war. The cause they were fighting for was often seemed ambiguous. Matt believed he was fighting for a principle, and those that fought against them were those that wished to exist outside the U.S. WPF law. Consequently, their destiny was to perish. He and all his friends in the WPF believed that the way they were defending these principles was the best way. He considered, who has the right to judge which is the best way? Matt remembered a conversation he had heard with one of the other members of the WPF. He couldn't remember his name. Was it? The happy-go-lucky company Matt followed around the WPF always left him the quiet one. Matt remembered not thinking about much but his duty during his WPF time. He remained serious about it. One day, Matt, not interested in his peers' jokes and childlikeness, decided to sit at another table during a lunch hour.
Where you going, Blair?
Jeff said. I'm not in the mood today, Welsh, Matt said defiantly.
Hey, Blair, consensus says, lighten up, man.
The table broke out in laughter. Matt shook his head in disgust and walked away. He sat at a table with 3 or 4 other soldiers, the unapproachable. He sat down and got some unwelcoming stares from those at the table. He ate in silence. There was an obvious tension in the air. Why don't you sit with your friends there, kid? Said a tall, well-built soldier at the corner of the table. I'm not dealing with their shit today, Matt said, meeting his glare. You don't have a problem with me sitting here, do you? Matt asked sarcastically. This, a testosterone-fueled battle. Of course not. The man in the corner smiled confidently and returned to eating. Matt did the same.
I hope we don't run into any of that local trouble we've been having. These people just don't get it,
another soldier said, in his camouflage t-shirt and matching pants. Don't get what, Norton? The one on the end of the table said.
What do you mean, don't get what? They don't get what we're doing here. We're here to help them, to protect the opportunity that's offered by the Revolution Act.
What about those who don't want what's offered?
They're stupid, Norton said. They have the opportunity to industrialize, to grow, and they just won't do it.
Do you really think we're out here to offer these people what's right for them, or what's right for our system? It may work, but what choice do they have?
Oh, God, Jim. Come on,
Norton said. Matt was curious at Jim's argument. This is a war we're fighting, one way or the other. We're the same as the Greeks, the Alliance, and the Axis in World War I and II. People aren't free. Of course they don't have a choice. What the hell do you know about why we're here?
You see, thinking about things that much isn't going to do any good. We're here to defend what's right. You know that, Jim.
And how is that different than these people fighting against us for what they feel is right?
Because they're wrong. This whole idealism thing that you buy into is bullshit. The outcome of wars determines who's right and wrong.
Then you don't think that you're here fighting for an ideal? Jim asked.
What the fuck is your point, Gray?
My point is this is exactly why this type of thing keeps happening over and over again. World War I, II, the Middle East series, and now this as a solution? He said, referring to the WPF. Think about it. Why is it different? He paused for effect. It isn't, he went on. Getting everyone to think the same, follow the same rules, is not the way. How is that wrong?
Why the hell are you here anyway? It's obvious you don't believe in what we're doing here. That's all I hear you saying.
I just told you why I was here, Gray said.
No, you didn't, Norton raised his voice.
Matt watched, in suspense. I was the same as you. Believed the same things. I learned that this attempt to make everything, all cultures the same, is not the way. I stay because I'm obligated here.
Go back to Canada, Gray.
Norton said with repugnance.
You're a fuck. Could you both just shut up?
One of the others chimed in. The table finished their meal in silence. Still, Matt remembered feeling like he should have been mad at the one in the corner. Gray was his name. Yet, what he had to say was interesting. It reminded him of what Becky's brother had said. Jamie was just like Gray in this sense. He saw the potential evil in what they and others like him did, but he didn't shy away from his duty. Matt wasn't sure if he agreed with the soldier at the table that day, just as he wasn't sure that he agreed with Jamie now. But the ideas that both men brought up were interesting anyway. There was a truth in them, though not the whole truth. The plane began to board. Matt picked up his bag and found his seat. He pulled out his audio player and drifted away to sleep before the plane ever took off. Matt woke up to the sun ready to set on Lake Erie. The Cleveland skyline began to silhouette into the sunlight. The captain's voice came over the PA, and he prepared the passengers to land. Matt watched as the Earth once again made contact with the plane with a smooth precision that displayed the skills that mankind had obtained. Honey, I'm telling you he's fine. Joseph Blair attempted to calm his wife. Night fell on the Blair household on Green Isle Circle. Amy walked in the door right in the middle of their typical husband-wife communique. Have you heard from Matt? Amy asked, sensing that he was the topic of conversation. Joe threw a stern glance at his daughter from behind his newspaper. He was letting her know that she wasn't helping things by getting her mother all worked up again. He still hasn't called, Lynn said, as she sat in the living room, plopping down on the couch. Knowing Matt, he'll just show up tomorrow all nonchalantly, she said, glancing at her father. The subtext of the look letting him know she had her mother under control. Lynn's phone chimed. Matt, Lynn said into the handset. How's your trip going? It went great, Mom. I'll have to tell you all about it. I just realized I haven't called. I haven't even had my cell phone out of my bag for the whole trip. Anyway, I thought I should let you know. I'm still alive. Well, thanks for thinking of us, his mother said sarcastically. Where are you? I'm in Cleveland, he said. My flight leaves in about an hour. I'll see you in the morning. I just wanted to call and say hey. Well, thank you, Matt. I was pretty worried.
She wouldn't shut up, Matt,
his father yelled from the background. Matt laughed. Okay, well, tell Dad I said hey as well. Okay, I'm gonna get going. See you in the morning. I'll be looking forward to it, Matt. Okay, Mom. Bye. I love you, Matt. Love you too. Matt smiled and hung up. Matt sat down at his window seat and looked out at a night portrait of the airport. The passengers slowly filed on. Matt watched the faces as they came on. There was a man and his daughter. She was adorable, with a blue dress, large white polka dots on it. He seemed kind of stressed, rubbing his forehead, revealing his life was very draining. It was not evident, however, in the endless chatter of his excited young daughter. No, honey, we won't be going up in space. Yes, they have parachutes. Matt laughed aloud as the man answered his daughter's questions. Next, a group of old women filed on the plane. The flow of passengers slowed. Just when Matt thought he would have the seat next to him remain vacant, an older man in dress clothes, a green and black jacket, sat next to him. Hi. Looks like this is my seat. Tom, he said, outstretching his hand. Matt. He shook his hand. I'm feeling a little sentimental. My grandson just graduated from college tonight, Tom said. He pulled out his phone and showed Matt a picture. Matt looked, obligingly. I wish his grandmother could have seen him. She would have said he looked handsome, Tom went on. I know she saw him from above, though. You know what I mean? Matt didn't reply. At first, he thought he should, but he realized the man wasn't really talking to him as much as he was just talking to talk. Matt thought he must be lonely without his wife. Perhaps this was much the same as Matt felt when he thought of Stephanie. The plane readied for takeoff. Matt watched out the window. He couldn't see the runway in the night. Instead, he watched the lights that framed the runway fall away from the plane. The man who sat next to him reached for a pillow. Tom reclined his chair as far back as it would go. It wasn't very far. He was obviously nervous and hoping to sleep through the nerve-wracking flight. Though Matt slept all day, he felt as though he could sleep now. He did. When he woke up, he would be home. The forest around him was bright and ethereal, almost unreal looking, but Matt accepted it for the company of its beauty. He was euphoric with freedom. He soaked up all that he saw around him. He saw a woman and a child far behind him as he stopped and turned around. He ran up a hill that was covered with pine needles, a hill serrated with trees. Just over the hill, in a small valley, he saw a cabin. He turned and saw others following him excitedly. He gave them a hurrying sign, waving them on with his arms. They were all smiles. He loved the two that were behind him, a woman and a young girl. He was presenting them with something special. This cabin was for them. Matt marveled at the dwelling. Standing next to the cabin, two deciduous trees with orange and fading yellow leaves, the colors of autumn. The leaves fell in a random sequence, programmed by agents of heaven. The blinding sunlight peered through the trees. Matt urged his girls to cover their eyes. They walked in. As Matt guided them in their blindness, the two girls joined him in a celebratory hug. He felt tears of joy stream down his cheeks. Matt gazed out the window and saw his worst fear. He squeezed the two girls to him more tightly than ever, as if he could protect them from the horror. A flash of light, truly blinding, approached them at the speed of Armageddon. Matt kicked, waking in terror, dreaming once again. He couldn't remember what it was. All he remembered was the emotion, the usual affair. It was fear, jet black fear. He was breathing heavily, collecting himself. He was happy to see that he hadn't awakened the man sitting next to him. He looked out the window at an ostensibly perfect cloudless night. The moon was only a sliver, the stars brighter than ever. He looked down upon the city that lay below and wondered which it was. He raised his arm in a stretch. Matt closed his eyes and yawned. As his lids opened, there was a brilliant flash from outside. Was it lightning? Matt thought. For a millisecond, there were dozens of illuminated sleeping faces. The brief flash seemed to take a snapshot of all of their faces. Voices could be heard sounding their concerns. What was that flash? Look, what was that down there? Oh my God, what is that? Confused and concerned, Matt looked out his own window. He saw a blue-orange flame rise from the ground on the horizon. There was a crescendo of brightness. In the distance, he saw other clouds looking almost exactly the same. Now, there was turbulence. The emergency lights in the plane came on. The walkways and the front of the plane lit up. Other passengers slowly began waking up. The turbulence increased. Matt looked to the rear of the plane through his window. The lights from the city below had extinguished. Soon, it sounded like a decent-sized crowd mutter. Everyone on the plane, all talking at once. The captain's voice came over the PA. He was shaken.
Ladies and gentlemen, please buckle your seatbelts. We're going to experience some more turbulence. We seem to have lost control of our electrical systems. We're making for an emergency landing.
The plane began making a hard left. It was trying to turn around. Fear tightened in Matt's chest. The captain left the mic open. The passengers could hear what was happening in the cockpit.
What do you mean you can't get anybody on the radio? We need an emergency landing,
yelled the captain.
No one is answering from Pittsburgh International,
said another voice.
All 3 engines are failing.
Panic began. Screams were heard at the sight of the horizon far off. It was covered in flames, crowned with a white, smoky cloud. The plane continued turning north, and then west, and then turning to the south, and finally east in a total 360 degrees. Turbulence shook the passengers like palm trees in a hurricane. The air marshal discarded his anonymity. He stood, ordering people to stay in their seats, hand on his holster.
Everyone, please remain calm,
the attendant said. Tom sat bracing himself in his chair, whispering a prayer. Tom, Matt said. Tom, you gotta get your seat upright. The man was frozen, locked in fear, his head firmly back against the seat, his hands grabbing the armrests, his knuckles white. His eyes were wide open, staring forward. Matt gave him a strong hit to the arm with the palm of his hand.
I can't,
Tom said. The turbulence was so bad, Matt couldn't do anything but hold on for dear life.
Come on,
Matt shouted, with panic, to Tom.
I can't, son. I was supposed to die today,
Tom morbidly confessed.
No, you aren't. Here, let me help you.
Matt couldn't give up. The sound of descent was around them. The plane screamed as it fell from the sky. The plane dove sharply. A hole ripped in the side of the plane. The air howled in, ripping seats right out of the plane. Passengers still belted to them. Matt grabbed at his oxygen mask, hanging from just above his head, fallen out of its ceiling compartment. Screams dissipated into the sound of rushing air. Tom was still frozen. Matt yanked at his arm. Tom shook his head.
I can't,
he yelled. Tom's voice lost in the sound of air being sucked out. The cockpit screamed desperate commands. The rushing noise of the air beat into Matt's head. He looked around for help with Tom. He was pressed into his seat. Matt could not move. Turning, the door flew out. The hole of the door gaped open, screeching, the high-pitched ripping of metal. There was no differentiation now. Just sound, just noise. Matt's seat, breaking loose, slammed against the ceiling of the plane, with him still strapped in. His seat ripped from the fuselage. The sound of breaking bone reverberated in his head. His forearm snapped in half with a loud crack. He crashed down to the floor in the middle of the aisle of the plane, cutting his face on the arm of another chair on the way down. With his left arm, he held onto the bottom of Tom's aisle seat. He fought the pull of the air pressure, with the seat still pulling at his waist. His broken right arm oscillated between coldness and shooting pain. The seat was still above him, pulling him, and the seatbelt still attached to his waist. With his arm wrapped around Tom's legs, Matt reached the seatbelt latch. He stretched with all his might. It was just out of reach. He was prepared to dislocate his shoulder if he had to. Matt extended his fingers, pulling at the flat latch. Unexpectedly, the seat was ripped from him. He was unprotected from the vacuuming air pressure of the descending plane. There was no one else in the aisle but a little girl still strapped into her seat, one row back. Her seat still seemed to be attached to the floor of the plane. Matt crawled to her. She sat in the seat, bracing herself, seatbelt on, her eyes closed. With his left healthy arm, Matt unbuckled her and held her close to his center. Just as she was released, the plane began to level out. He lay in the aisleway, holding her for dear life. Descent was soon again felt in their stomachs, falling, gnashing both broken ends of his bones into the ground. The plane pulled him into the floor once again. It felt as if they were falling for hours, but in actuality, it was only a few minutes. Matt knew it was just a matter of seconds before they crashed into the ground. The plane shook violently. Matt could hear nothing. He wanted to accept that he was about to die, but he couldn't. He couldn't bear the thought now. The little girl in his arms, she couldn't die. He held her close, a human shield for her. A sound like a skull cracking the pavement in the dead of winter was felt and heard. The back half of the plane tore away. Matt watched people fly into the air like dolls or figurines. He was thrown from side to side and ceiling to floor before the deed was done. And still, he would not let go of the little girl. Hold on, he thought. Amy Blair had just gotten off the phone with the Justin Sampson. He was the nicest, cutest guy she knew. He was mad about her. He would visit her at work, and she attempted to give him just the right amount of attention on his visits. Not too much, not too little. It had been all summer, and today, he had finally asked her out. They exchanged numbers. Justin finally called. Life could not get any better for Amy right now. She was worried about her brother, but deep down, she knew that Matt would be okay. Justin was so cute on the phone, she thought. He was shy. A guy like Justin didn't need to be so shy, but she could tell that he held her in high esteem. He had her on a pedestal. There were literally stars in her eyes, and his. Amy and her mother talked in detail about Justin. Recently, they were so concerned with Matt that she didn't have the opportunity to explain that this Friday they would go out. I have to call Jen and tell her, Amy thought. There was a knock at her door. It was her mother. Hey, hon, we're going to go out to eat tomorrow night when Matt gets home. It would be nice if you could make it, her mother said. Okay, I'll be there. I'm going to see what time is good with Matt. I'll let you know. Sounds good. Let me know, Amy answered absently. Okay, honey. Good night. Her mother paused as she went to turn away. Hey, she said. Did you talk to you-know-who today? Amy smiled. She couldn't wait to tell her. She couldn't wait to tell anyone. He just called. Her sentence ended in a squeak. Her mother ran into the room, and they embraced. Oh my gosh, Amy, her mother said back. The two were like schoolgirls. Are you going out? Friday, Amy said. The two laughed in celebration. They had to discuss what she would wear. There was a colossal sonic vibration that shook the house. The sound of angry thunder in the nearby distance. Simultaneously, Amy and Lynn Blair looked out the window to see a vivid flash of light. The night looked as though it was a brilliant sunny day. Before either of them could speak, the shockwave hit. In the midst of their wonder, overly, Green Isle Circle, Amy and Lynn Blair were vaporized. Matt awoke. Darkness. There was fire nearby. The jet black of the night consumed all else, not letting any light escape. Pain. There was a furious pain in his arm. Breathing sent shockwaves of pain through his body. He reached to it. He fingered the bone sticking from the flesh. In his left arm, a young girl, unconscious and appearing to be alive. Matt remembered the crash now. He wondered how he was out of the plane, how he was alive. If he was not alive, this definitely was not an ideal afterlife. He sat up, more pain in his chest, his ribs. He couldn't take a breath. He froze in agony. The little girl began to wake from his arms. "Where's my daddy?" she asked. Barely able to speak, he extended his lungs. "I don't know." Matt's eyes adjusted. The little girl looked around unafraid, perhaps in shock. The little girl didn't have the ability to understand the chance of their survival, the miracle of their survival. She only wanted her father. Duty became his purpose. His WPF training set in. The fire in the distance could now be identified as part of the wreckage of the plane. It was 100 yards off from them. This sudden sense of purpose sobered him. It helped distract him from their current reality. I have to find him, Matt thought. He narrowed his focus, only letting his mission into his perception. Stay here, honey. Right here under this tree. I'm going to go get your daddy, Matt explained. This hope of finding her father became their hope. He walked quickly. His pain was distant, adrenaline pumping through his body. He began jogging to the twisted aircraft, increasing his speed, holding his right arm with his left. The fires of destruction at the main section of the plane became larger in his field of view. Almost there, almost to her father, he thought. What remained of the plane was ripped down the middle, front to back. With his left arm, he pulled himself up the circular tube. With ends of the hollow tube aflame, he would enter through the split top. He sat at the top of the arch, positioned himself to jump down inside the fuselage. He looked at his right arm and saw his mangled flesh with a whitish gray bone pressing through the rip. He did not comprehend what he saw. The flesh didn't seem his own. He couldn't feel his arm. Matt looked down into the plane. He saw the back of the section in flames. Seats had been ripped out, though some passengers remained in their seats, dead. It was a horror show.
Hello? Can anyone hear me?
Matt called down. Matt's own voice seemed distant from him now, his ears ringing. No answer. He dropped himself down into the aisleway of the plane. He landed, felt a great bolt of pain shoot up his arm. He fell to the ground in agony, feeling consciousness begin to slip away from him. He couldn't remain quiet. He heard himself moan in pain, not able to restrict his voice. He sobbed, tried to breathe carefully. The pain was so that he couldn't breathe at all. He didn't want to move, if only to save himself the suffering. For a long moment, Matt lay disoriented in the wreckage of the plane, holding his mangled arm. He thought of the little girl. She waited for him. Her only chance was for him to save her, find her father. He opened his tear-filled eyes and looked around. There was no one. Nothing stirred in the darkness.
Hello?
Matt shrieked in a broken, crackled voice.
Can anyone hear me?
Matt crawled down the aisleway, unable to stand up. He pulled himself from seat to seat, looking for any sign or life. The place was death itself. He had made it through 5 rows of seats, heading backwards, finding none alive. He came to a seat, looked up.
Hello?
He called again. The man who sat in the seat was half decapitated, one of his eyes hanging out. Hauntingly, it looked directly at him. It was Tom. Matt could not save him. Suddenly, the world in all its terrible glory flooded Matt's awareness.
No!
Screamed Matt, giving into despair. He wildly tore down the aisle.
Oh God! Oh God!
Matt cried. He flipped himself to his back. He screamed to the black sky above.
Help! Help! Help!
He sobbed and tried to control his breathing. He was trying to manage the pain, but he was panicking, losing control. He looked to his right, and through a tear, he saw a woman with pieces of glass stuck in her face and all down her body. Like ice stalagmites smashed into flesh, she was stabbed at least a dozen times. Matt got to his feet and began screaming denials into the dead of the night. He ran to the front of what was left of the plane. Corpses were all around him, seeming to reveal the horror of the dead all around him. There were no survivors. He jumped, ignoring the pain of his maimed arm. He tried to pull himself up onto the arch of the plane. On the 3rd attempt, he crashed to the ground once more. He was exhausted. The fall may have hurt, but he did not feel it. His pain was far away again. He just wanted to sleep when all of a sudden he heard a miracle. Another voice calling to him. Am I really hearing that? Matt thought. Is this real?
Hey! I hear you! Where are you?
The voice was outside. Matt heard climbing on the outside wall.
Hey! Are you alive?
A pair of young eyes peered down at Matt. He didn't have the energy to push the wind through his larynx to make a noise, but he tried.
Yes!
He rasped out.
Yes, help!
The boy hopped down and picked Matt up. Here, let me boost you up, he said. With Matt's last bit of strength, he pulled himself up, being pushed up by the boy below him. He got up on the arch of the ripped plane's roof. He took a deep breath in pain and balanced himself, crunching his teeth together in order to cope.
Hey!
Said the boy.
Can you pull me up?
Matt turned and let down his left arm. He tried to pull, but couldn't. The boy just seemed to climb up his arm to the arch. They both sat and breathed deeply. Matt stared at the sky and felt as though consciousness was leaving him again. Hey! Matt felt a shake at his left arm with these words. We gotta slide down. Matt stared at the boy, trying to regain control of his consciousness. He was just a kid, younger than Matt. His face was carved up and bloody, but the look in his eyes was determined. Matt looked at the ground that seemed a mile away. He slid the curve of the plane and crashed into the ground, feeling the pain rip through his body. He felt the skin that framed his bone rip. This time, he did pass out. What seemed to be days later, Matt woke to see the scrape-faced boy waking him. It had only been a minute or two. He rose. Matt remembered the little girl. Wait, Matt said, beginning to follow the boy. There's a little girl. Over this way. Come on. They ran towards the tree where he left the little girl. She still waited, sitting crisscross, admiring the night sky. She was quietly singing. She became silent as they approached. Daddy? She said in her hopeful, childlike tone. Daddy? Matt fell to his knees in front of her. He cried. He held her in his arms. There was nothing else he could do. I'm sorry. I couldn't find your daddy. He looked at her. She stared back, not understanding the situation. She sized up Matt in the way a child sizes up a stranger. He looked her over. She was all but untouched, only a little dirty. She was okay. The boy stood behind them, looking concerned. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. "Yes," Matt said. "Build a fire. We need some heat. I'm freezing." The boy immediately turned and ran off to get wood. Matt watched as the fire began to burn. After a few minutes, it was burning bright in the still, dark night. Looking at his soiled arm, he had lost a lot of blood. With an open wound like this, he knew what he had to do. He'd have to close the wound if he wanted to save himself from infection, if he wanted to survive. "Take her into the woods for a while," Matt said. Matt sat in pain, his shoulders raised and his breath quick and shallow. He stared at the fire. He met the stare of the boyish man who seemed confused at his request. "Now!" Matt yelled, not able to hide the pain the word caused. The boy grabbed the girl's hand and nicely asked her to follow him into the woods. Matt, looking at his arm, faced the gruesome truth of his humanity. The bone stuck out, and he had to get it back into his skin, set against the bone where it snapped. He began the painfully long process of taking his shirt off. He prepared it as a makeshift sling. He put the shirt in his mouth. It would double as a bite plate for the pain and a sling. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the bone into his skin with the ball of his palm. A muffled scream at the pain, he felt the friction of the fractured bone rub the end of the other half of the bone still in his skin. It slipped past the set point. He had pushed it too far, and now it threatened to tear the inner of his forearm. In hysterics, he called for help, panicking, as he had just sent the boy and the young girl away. He screamed, not able to breathe. He pushed it out as hard as he could against his vocal cords. The young man came sprinting from the woods. He stopped short of the fire, stood back. He was wary of Matt as he flailed around. The boy was terrified. Matt tried to regain control of himself. The pain was simply beyond him now, past his capacity to deal with it. The little girl stood, staring from behind the boy. This offered Matt some strange boost of strength. "You have to help me set the bone," Matt said, stuttering. He lifted his arm to the boy, who hesitantly came closer. "Set it," Matt said.
"Then tie it tight with this shirt."
The boy put his hand on Matt's wound. He looked Matt in the eye.
"Do it!"
Matt pleaded. A pause.
"Do it now!"
The boy pushed, aligning the bone. Matt screamed, felt the grip of consciousness, leaving him once again. He tried to hold on. The pain was just more than Matt could take. He writhed in pain, kicking in the dirt. The young man walked to the fire, skewered a red-hot piece of wood ember from the fire with a knife, then, quickly and decisively, placed it against the opening of Matt's wound. There was a sizzling sound, the cauterizing of flesh, an unsavory smell. Matt winced, fell silent, not making a sound. His head dropped to the ground. The young man quickly tied the shirt to Matt's arm. He jumped back, not sure if what he had just done would wake him. He was almost in tears himself at the sight of Matt lying on the ground unconscious. The little girl approached. She looked down on him. The boy tried to hold her back, but was too late, or she was too intent. She looked down at the man who had just saved her, laying unconscious by the fire. Her eyes were wide. Matt woke to a smoky dusk in the woods. He heard a voice in the distance. It was approaching. Hey, wake up. It was the boyish man who had pulled him from the plane. "Hey, there's no one coming. There's a plane crash, and there's no sign of anyone to help us." There was the start of panic in his voice. Matt sat up, feeling pain from his arm and ribs exaggerated by the early morning. He was stiff, exhausted, yet he was wide awake due to the circumstances. Beside him, the little girl he had saved from the plane crash. His arm had a dull ache. It was cold. "Where in the hell are we?" asked Matt. "I don't know. Pennsylvania somewhere." Matt looked around at the endless forest of trees that surrounded them. They were as far as he could see in every direction. "I don't get why no one's coming," he repeated. "What the hell happened last night?" the boy said. He was obviously overwhelmed, exhausted, and starting to lose his wits. "Can you carry her?" Matt asked, glancing down at the little girl still asleep. "Yeah." "We need to move. Alert someone that there are survivors, Matt said. But first, can you go back to the plane? See if there's anything you can find that's useful. I had a green army bag, the initials MB on it. If you see it, bring it back. The boy seemed untouched by the crash. Matt considered the possibility. He wasn't even on the flight, but they were in the middle of nowhere. Giving him tasks seemed to at least stop his internal hysterics for the time being. The young man ran off towards the wreckage of the plane. Shortly, he returned with a green army satchel that had belonged to Matt. It was still intact. Is this the one? The boy asked. Yeah, Matt replied. I'll carry that. You take her. It's fucking terrible back there, the young man said. He was visibly shaken up again. Matt didn't say anything, as if not acknowledging his extreme behavior would make it go away. He looked to the ground and waited for him to heed his request. The boy gently picked the little girl up and followed Matt away from the fuselage, or what now had burnt down to embers. The trio headed into the woods in silence. They walked for hours. It seemed the young man carried the girl without much effort. There was nothing, no one around. The height of summer had left the trees full and green, yet many of the ripe green leaves had inexplicably fallen to the ground. It was a strange sight. Not much was said between the two who were awake. They were hypervigilant, experiencing the shock and fatigue such conditions bring. In front of them and behind them, there were nothing but trees, endless forest. Behind him, Matt heard the boy fall to his knees, carrying the girl. Matt turned, looked. He got up, trying to mask his fall, and kept moving, though he steadily was behind. The terrain was hilly. There had to be wildlife all around them that they couldn't see, Matt thought. But they knew it was there from the noises heard in the distance. It was an ominous reminder that night would fall and shelter would be needed. For a second time, the boy tripped. It was time to take a break. Let's stop for a while. It's past noon, and it's hot, Matt suggested. He looked in his bag. Matt's arm pulsed with pain. He was nauseated, dehydrated, and they had no water. In the bag were 2 fruit pies bought at the airport. They were crushed, smashed in their wrappers. He handed one to the boy and tried to wake the girl. The young man all but devoured the pie, crumbs on his chin, more falling on his shirt, soaked with sweat. The girl slowly opened her eyes. She looked around, confused. She called for her father. Daddy? She looked to Matt. No, honey, just me, he said empathetically. Here, he gave her half of his pie. We have to get some water. Let's move to lower ground, Matt continued as he scanned their surroundings. The boyish man's attention was with his distant thoughts. He was nervous, anxious. Matt studied him. He was worried. He seemed a little off balance, unpredictable. They moved to lower ground. Matt realized they probably wouldn't be going their separate ways anytime soon. It was time the trio went from polite strangers to acquaintances. They needed to learn each other's names. What is your name? Matt asked. The words seemed to take a few minutes to process. John, he replied. John, I'm Matt. I'd shake your hand if I could. John was still deep in nervous thought, searching through the wood for threats. And what is your name? Matt said, raising his tone towards the little girl. Angela, she said, in a childish tone. Hi, Angela. I'm Matt. Hi, Matt, she said as she finished the rest of the fruit pie. Both John and Angela, and Matt assumed he as well, were in shock. Their normal processes were not functioning. Matt examined his own cognition. He thought out his priorities and decided they best keep walking, and they best keep talking as well. They headed down a steep hill. At the bottom, a stream flowed. Looks like we get a drink, Matt said, showing relief in his voice. John took off running. He ran into the shallow stream, past his ankles, and fell to his knees, cupping the water and drinking madly. Matt and Angela followed slowly behind. Matt held her shoulder, slowing her pace. Take it easy, Angela, he said. John lay beside the small stream, on his back, breathing heavily after drinking. He was beginning to act more and more strangely. Matt gave Angela a drink from the stream, keeping a close eye on John. As Matt knelt to the flowing water, he watched John's black t-shirt rise and fall with each breath. Matt considered the situation. He was dealing with a young man in shock. This made John somewhat a hazard, mainly for Angela, but in Matt's condition, a threat for them both. "Are you okay, John?" Matt asked. There was no answer, just the sound of the hot breeze, swaying leaves, and his breath. "John," Matt repeated. "You okay?" "Why is there no one looking for the plane?" John said plainly.
Why is there no one looking for us? For survivors?"
His tone began to rise, irritation and panic in his voice.
Why the hell did the plane crash? What's going on?
John was now raising his voice. "Calm down," Matt said firmly. "I don't know what's going on, but you have to work with me. My arm is broken. I have to get to a doctor."
"You're in shock, John.
"I am too. Let's settle down." John stood up.
"I'll settle down when you tell me where the hell we're going."
John was now irate. Matt guarded Angela. He stood in front of the young girl, giving John a look, indicating that he had to settle down. Now, John began kicking the ground with his black leather boots. He fell to his knees, punching the rocky shores of the stream. He tripped, fell. Now, he sobbed. Matt sighed and looked around. He searched in a full circle, tried to find some magic destination. Through the heavy tree line, he saw something. "There's a road over there," Matt said. John looked up slowly, his cries slowing. Matt could see that his wheels were turning. John pumped up and began running towards it.
"John, slow down,"
he called. The tension caused the pain in Matt's body to jolt him sharply. He raised his shoulders, supporting his wrapped arm. He started after him, motioning to Angela to follow him. The road was a state route, not an interstate, but it was the first sign that suggested they were near any kind of civilization. They followed the highway eastward. It wasn't a very strong logic, but it was towards where the flight carried them. It was strange. There wasn't a car in sight. It was an eerie thing, not seeing any indication of human life. A sign on the road let them know the next exit would be in 9 miles. Angela turned out to be quite the talker as the walk progressed. She was an open book. She comforted herself with talk of her friends in her neighborhood, and her favorite characters and the stories her daddy told her. She also told them of her knowledge of the seasons and how planes fly. The list went on. There was no shortage of knowledge with this little girl. In the intense summer heat, they walked until the sun was setting. Matt tried to direct her prattle away from the questions of her father. He didn't know how he'd deal with that. She discussed her biography. She was in first grade, 7 years old. Angela ventured into topics that Matt really wasn't sure of what she was talking about, but she was enough to keep the situation somewhat light. At least, it helped divert his attention from his chest and his broken arm. "Mount Pocono," Matt said. There was a Pennsylvania Department of Transportation sign showing options for accommodations. "There's a lodge up there," Matt said. "Let's go check it out." Matt took the lead, though he was exhausted. With the exhaustion, his pain escalated. He tried not to look at his arm. It was cold to the touch, numb, the shirt bandage soiled in dry blood. When he looked, he felt himself panic at the thought of losing his arm. At the top of a long driveway, overdue for a refinish, crumbling into gravel, sat the Pocono Mountain Lodge. There were half a dozen cars in the parking lot. To their relief, a group of people sat in the lobby. The digital bell sounded at the door as they entered, yet the group inside remained huddled around the television. They didn't talk amongst themselves or even turn to look as the bell quieted. Matt, Angela, and John approached the others, who sat staring like zombies at the images on the animated screen. On the picture panel, a horrible sight. Wreckage, carnage, death. There was only the picture on the TV, no sound, just pictures of destruction. John was the first to speak up, appalled at the sight. "What happened?" He gave no time for an answer. "What the hell is going on?" A middle-aged man with a beard, a ball cap, with the emblem of a local tractor supply company, and a blue flannel shirt, turned to look. He gave an expression of surprise to see the ragged company of stragglers who had wandered in. He had a distant look, still trying to process the images as well. "Bombs," he said weakly. "Hundreds, throughout the whole country." The man took a second to come out of his fog. Others began turning to notice the 3 newcomers. A woman with long grayish red hair spoke.
Oh my God! Are you okay?
She walked to Matt, looked at his arms. I need a doctor, Matt said.
Jimmy, call a doctor,
she said, alarmed. Her sudden concern seemed out of place.
Damn it, Charlotte. I told you the phone is out. There's no signal.
The bearded man with the hat had spoken.
We're going to town to get a doctor. His arm, Jimmy, look.
Everyone acted bizarrely, as if in between moments of panic and normalcy, no one had quite adjusted. It was unclear whether Jimmy would try to get a doctor or what was going to happen.
Yins need to clean up, she said. Let's get you to a room.
The woman called Charla led Matt to one of the guest rooms nearby. John and Angela followed.
This room here should work,
she said.
Thank you,
Matt said, realizing how physically drained he was.
There is soap and anything else you need in the bathroom,
Charlotte went on. Matt had only his bag and his shirt, soiled as his sling. He had nothing else. What did I just see on that TV? Matt wondered. He couldn't grasp it at this point, even with Charla, John, and Angela watching. Matt laid down on the bed and lost consciousness immediately. Matt woke. Darkness. He didn't know where he was. He tried to sit up. Pain. He fell to the pillow once again. His dreams had taken him far away from this place, so far he couldn't tell which was the dream. He scanned the area around him, moving only his head. There was no light. There was no life. The warmth of the world was vanquished. Darkness was all he could see, all he could feel. His senses roused. Slowly, the steady ache, the pain, entered into his awareness. An aching arm, throbbing ribs. Am I home? Wait, he thought. What happened? Something terrible. He answered himself in his mind. He searched his awareness briefly. A horrific memory surfaced. The crash. His arm. The little girl. The wreckage on the TV screen. The boy and the walk. The walk to wherever he was now. What's going on? What was the bright light that flashed outside the window on the plane? Did it cause the crash? Why did no one come looking for the wreckage of the plane? So many questions remained unanswered. He remembered some things. He was at the Pocono Mountain Lodge. The people here watched the TV screen. There were images of annihilated cities, ash raining from the sky, abandoned cars, in the big cities, and aerial shots of craters where great metropolitan areas used to be. The soundless images informing them the country was under attack by an unknown enemy. Matt roused himself, fighting the pain in his arm. He tried not to use it or move it, but the pain remained. His arm was bandaged now, he realized. He pulled his legs out from under the covers of his bed, moving his feet onto the floor. He reached into the darkness. Next to the bed, a light. He turned the knob. The light illuminated the dark room. He was in one of the lodge's rooms, he recalled. Matt now remembered the older woman who led him here. There was a television mounted on the wall in front of the bed. He got up and walked towards it. He turned it on. The silence was destroyed by the crackling static. Then, silence. He passed through channels. There was nothing for a time. Then, a picture. It was a frantic news anchor person reporting from a makeshift studio. The images on the screen were of fire and destruction. It took a moment before Matt could focus on the words the reporter said.
These are the images of Washington, D.C. It has been more than 72 hours since the chaos began. Over 100 cities from coast to coast of the United States and Canada have experienced huge explosions in what appears to be a mass orchestrated bombing. Countless countries and organizations have claimed responsibility, and are calling this an attack on the U.S. and the West. If indeed this is an orchestrated effort, the scope is unprecedented. There is no sign of a U.S. president as the living members of the government struggle to maintain order. Again, no confirmation on who may be responsible. We don't know how much longer we're able to report, but we will continue for as long as we can. Right? Okay. We're being moved to a safer location. Many of the explosions were nuclear and the fallout is very deadly. We'll be back to report shortly.
Static. Silence. The identical broadcast began again after a minute. Matt watched the loop several times. He hoped there would be something new. There was only the same. Washington, D.C. was near Overly, his hometown. What had happened to my family? He wondered. Fear ran thick in Matt's veins. He felt cold. Here he sat somewhere in Pennsylvania, once again, immobilized, a broken arm and ribs. The world at war. There was no way for him to know if his mother and father and his sister were alive. Stephanie. Was she alive? He had to know. There had to be some way. Somehow, she still remained his hope. If she was gone, his family gone, what would be his reason to carry on? He shuffled through his bag to check for his cell phone, lost from the crash. Still, it wasn't there. He picked up the lodge phone, dialed 0. He was going to call the operator to see if he could get connected. There was only a busy signal. He tried again. Same result. Matt would find her when he got home. He knew this now. He firmly decided everything was supposed to be okay. This great adventure, away from his family, his home, he had had more than his share. Was all he loved there at all? Did it exist any longer? They have to be alive. He changed the channel, searching for new information. The same broadcast appeared on each channel. He watched again and again. The night seemed an eternity. He was alone. Alive in a world suddenly gone calloused, hopeless, and empty. This has been an audio presentation of The Landscape of a Heart, an audio novel. Chapter 5, Descent. Please subscribe to this feed. The Landscape of the Heart by R.P. Watts. Copyright 2020. Stay tuned next week for Chapter 6, Jacobs. Please subscribe to this feed.